season a bit late because of that. But we have a couple of lectures coming on the 12th of November. David Parsons of the one of the top people of the Christian Embassy here on the issue of Christian friends and enemies of Israel. On the one hand, there is this incredible phenomenon of people in the Christian world, and Justice has just returned from Norway and Sweden, who are far more enthusiastic about Israel than the local Jews. And on the other hand, I am convinced that in mainstream Protestantism we have currents today which are becoming our second biggest enemy after the Muslims. Phenomenon which is not watched by anybody, which is not researched by anybody. And I've asked somebody who at least follows the Protestant communities in the world to explain that. And then on the 25th we have a debate on my new book, Behind the Humanitarian Mask, the Nordic countries, Israel and the Jews, between Ephraim Zorov and Ambassador Tzvi Masel. Today it's a great pleasure to introduce here a speaker who has already spoken here, Dr. Mitchell Bard. He is the executive director of the non-profit American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. He's a foreign policy analyst. He lectures frequently on US Middle East policy. He's the director of the Jewish Virtual Library, which is the most comprehensive online encyclopedia of Jewish history and culture. He is the author of 18 books, and the two of them I'll hold up here. The one is 48 Hours of Kristallnacht, and the other is Will Israel Survive? I've asked Mitchell to speak here about a phenomenon which is relatively new, which I would say didn't exist 5 years ago almost. Israel studies at university. What motivated it? When did it start? Which universities do have today Israel studies? What have been the experiences so far with having Israeli academics, some of which are fairly doubtful characters, speak at American, teach at American universities? Why do you need it in addition to Jewish studies, Holocaust studies? What are its contents? How do you find professors? How do you train other people who can teach in the future at a number of university? And last but not least, how much does it cost? And how much money has already been invested? And is the effort worth it? Well, that's a lot, Mitchell, so I think
Thank you very much. Yes, you gave me a lot to do. I wasn't planning on that much. I'm surprised so many people could come out today. Thank you for all coming. I thought it would be an even bigger crowd if we would have at least advertised it as, is Obama good for the Jews or not? You can ask me that later. Next way, if you believe the polls, it's already done, but can't always believe them. First, let me say that, as Manfred was saying, the phenomenon of Israel studies in the United States is fairly new, whereas most people, I don't think, realize how old Arab studies and Islamic studies are. The first program in Islamic studies funded by the Arabs directly was actually in 1969, when King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Aramco, the Saudi-American Arabian oil company, funded a program at a small college, which actually doesn't even exist anymore. But since '69, the Arabs have understood that one way to try to influence American policy and the image of Islam and Arabs was to go through the universities. And they've invested something like $200 million, $300 million. I have a new book coming out next year where I'll have more documentation about this, but they've invested tens of millions of dollars with the explicit aim of influencing American opinion because in part they understood that from an early point they could not beat the so-called Israeli lobby on the merits of the arguments or in the political arena in Congress, and they had to try to do it in other ways. And so they've invested very heavily in Arab and Islamic studies, and it's very easy for them because, first of all, if you offer a university, as they did, the Saudis did, Georgetown and Harvard, $20 million, not very many university presidents are going to turn it down. The other part of it is that they know that whoever is hired to do Arab or Islamic studies is going to have a certain orientation. And they are not very worried that, for example, Georgetown is going to hire an Israeli authority on Islam to teach. They know what they're going to be getting. And in fact, the Georgetown investment was to create a center of Muslim and Christian understanding. Notice the religion that's missing in that equation, and I frequently point out to potential donors to Georgetown that they might want to ask why it's not the Center for Muslim, Jewish, and Christian Understanding. But the main point is that the Arabs have been investing for now 40 years almost in Arab and Islamic studies to present their vision, their version of Middle East history, and their sanitized version, for the most part, of Islam. Israel studies remains a relatively new area. There was actually an Association of Israel Studies created in 1985, but that association from the beginning, and even to some extent still today, is really a professional association, and it wasn't so much dedicated to a mission, especially outside of Israel. And many people would suggest that it's more appropriately called the Association of Anti-Israel Studies, because for many years a lot of the key figures in the association were people who were among the most outspoken critics of Israel, some of the post-Zionist revisionist historians. I think that has begun to change over the last few years as more mainstream, I would say more credible and more informed scholars have taken a more active role in the association. In terms of centers for Israel study, they're even newer. The first centers for Israel studies were created in 1998, and they were really driven by the concept and the idea that it was important to teach American students about modern Israel. There's some argument between the two centers who was first. They started relatively within a few weeks of each other, a few months of each other. One was at Emory University, where Ken Stein started the program. Ken still runs it. And this is a center that's basically Ken Stein. It's more or less a one-person operation. He brings in visiting professors and sometimes postdocs, but we call it a center even though it's primarily been Ken, who has, he's a historian by training, and so most of the focus there is on modern Israel in a historical context. The other center was created at American University by Howard Wachtel, who actually was an economist, and his specialty wasn't even Israel, but he had an idea, which I think is the one that we today think is the most important, and that is that Israel should be studied the same way you study any other country in the world, the way you study Russia, China, France. That is, it should be seen in the full context of a country with art, culture, history, politics, economics. And so what he did was set up a interdisciplinary program with about 20 professors from different departments who all could contribute to the teaching of courses related to Israel and the study of Israel. But the problem there to this day is that American University hasn't had an anchor. They haven't had a professor of Israel studies on a full-time basis to really drive a research agenda at that university. There wasn't much going on in Israel studies from 1998 until really about 2004, 2005. And then it was the motivation really of the Second Intifada that created the incentive within the American Jewish philanthropic community to try to do something to promote the education and scholarship about Israel, because as I'm sure you know, during the Second Intifada in the United States, there was a lot of political activism on college campuses. And most of that activism was focused on student activities. You had these mock checkpoints and quote-unquote apartheid walls that students would build, and all kinds of anti-Israel political activities on the campus outside the classroom. And the Jewish community became very alarmed, thought that the community, that the campuses were on fire, anti-Semitism was breaking out everywhere, and they were the fire department who had to come in and put the fire out. The reality was, and I think I spoke about this a year ago, is there was very little anti-Semitism, and there still is today on college campuses, that there are places where anti-Semitic events occur. There is anti-Israel activities by some students, but by and large it's restricted to a handful of campuses, most of which are politically active campuses that have been anti-Israel for 20, 30, 40 years. A place like Berkeley, where I was there during the first Lebanon War. And so it's not surprising that the kind of activism I saw there in 1982 would be going on again in 2002. What I argued to philanthropists and people throughout the American Jewish community was that the problem was actually much more serious and much more endemic, and that it wasn't really what was going on in the quad outside the classroom. The really more serious issue and the more serious problem was inside the classroom. And there we saw really a two-sided problem. And we were able to quantify one side of it, and that is the lack of any courses about Israel. We did a study a couple of years ago. We found that 53% of the universities, including all the top 100 in the United States, had 0 courses on Israel, and 77% had 0 or 1. So if you wanted to study Israel at some of America's elite universities, you couldn't, even if you wanted to. So a major problem was simply the absence of information. The second problem we had, which we know more anecdotally, is that the things that were being taught about Israel were not very good. At the least, and at the most, they were outright anti-Israel, and occasionally going as far as being anti-Semitic. So in order to try to address this problem, philanthropists then began to drive the agenda with money. That is, instead of it coming from the academic side, it really was being driven more by the community, which wanted to see a change in this environment. And it took some education, and it's still a process going on today, because the philanthropists, you don't see what's going on in the classroom. You don't know that Walt and Mearsheimer, the things they put in their book, The Israel Lobby, are being taught every day in colleges around the country, because the students don't talk about it, it doesn't get into the newspapers, and it's a much less evident form of anti-Israel activities. So it's been an education process to inform philanthropists that this is really where the battle is being fought and where the future leaders of America are getting their information. They are going to be the future journalists, the future members of Congress, the future decision makers, and if they're taking a course in most universities today, they're learning Walt and Mearsheimer and things of that type. So starting around 2004, 2005, there began to be some investments. And one of the early investments was by the American Jewish Committee and some other philanthropists at Brandeis, where they created something they called a Summer Institute. And the idea of that was, I think, a very good one, which was to take professors who teach other subjects, perhaps something in Jewish studies but unrelated to Israel, give them a very intense workshop with some of the best scholars on all aspects of Israel, so that at the end of this workshop they could go back to their university and offer courses on Israel. I think now the program has had about 100 professors go through the program, and they are now spread across campuses around the country, teaching courses on Israel and acting as resources to bring in programming and other professors who can talk about Israel. So I think this has been a very important development, because even in the best of circumstances, we are not going to have a scholar of Israel on every campus in America. There are places where it wouldn't make any sense to invest in a professor in Israel studies. So it's just as well that we have just people who are trained sufficiently to offer courses that can make a difference. Later, just in the last year, Brandeis got huge investments of about $30 million to create a full-fledged Center of Israel Studies. It's led by Ilan Tron, very good, very well-regarded scholar, really a brilliant guy in terms of, I think, understanding how to structure the field of Israel studies and build a center. And I think it's going to be extremely successful. Right now, it's the most well-funded center in the United States. It's the one that has the only real graduate students in the field of Israel studies, and is, I think, over the next few years, because of their resources, going to build the first really major program. There are a total of 9 centers. But again, most of these centers have been, up until now, one-person operations. Even Brandeis, up until it got this big endowment, was Ilan Tron. That was the Center of Israel Studies. At NYU, it's a fellow named Ron Zwei. At UCLA, University of Maryland, they just created Centers of Israel Studies in just the last year and a half. And at the moment, they have nobody to teach Israel. They're looking for chairs in Israel studies. There's also centers at Columbia, Denver, Yeshiva University started one with a slightly different perspective. For most of the field of Israel studies, we talk about it in terms of modern Israel. Yeshiva University, because of the unique nature of that institution, sees it more as the land of Israel studies, so that they go back far beyond the modern period to the biblical period, and consider that still part of Israel studies. The American University is the first one to have a minor in Israel studies. Some of you may know, in the American system, most people, every student has a major, and then some students take a secondary field as a minor. And this was a major development because it really established Israel studies as something that's a separate academic field in which to study. At this point, no majors have been created, but they're talking about doing it. We have about 15 chairs now in Israel studies that have been endowed. And the thing about the chairs is that they're very expensive. It costs, depending on the university, anywhere from $1 million to $5 million to fund a chair in Israel studies. Well, there are plenty of philanthropists in America with the resources to fund these, but so far they haven't done it a lot. But there are a couple of problems with funding chairs in Israel studies. One problem is finding people who are good enough to fill those chairs. And there are relatively few people who have the academic stature to fill an endowed chair. Those in the United States system typically are people who are seen as very senior scholars with long reputations in the academic community, who can bring to the campus a lot of prestige, be fundraisers, be people who will attract a lot of attention to the campus. And there just aren't that many scholars of that quality, certainly in the United States and even here in Israel, unless you were to raid all the universities for the most senior and most renowned scholars. You couldn't fill 15 chairs in the United States. So it's been very difficult. Several of the chairs are still unfilled. The University of Maryland's been looking for 2 years. UCLA's been looking for, I think, more than 2 years. So it's very difficult to find people who are good. Some of those chairs now are beginning to be given to more junior people, that the universities have concluded that they can't find these scholars with the great reputations that they really would like, and that what they're going to need to settle for is younger scholars who have more potential and who can help build up their programs in the future. And so you have a few people, like at Michigan State, a very young woman who had very little seniority, took the chair there and is expected to build up the program. A fellow at Wisconsin is doing the same. The other big problem with establishing chairs in Israel studies is that, as most of you probably know, you cannot dictate to an American university who they are going to hire. That is, basically you give them your money and then they can do with it what they want. And you cannot always trust universities to do what you think they're going to do. And we had a very dramatic example of this at Berkeley, where a philanthropist in the Bay Area said, Berkeley's terrible, we're going to fix it. Here's $5 million for an endowment for a visiting Israel professor. Berkeley said, thank you very much. They put the most anti-Israel faculty members on the search committee and chose the most anti-Israel Israeli they could find. So it can be very dangerous. Part of the process of educating philanthropists is to try to inform them about how universities work and to try to get them to find ways, and it can be done, to structure their gifts to the university in a way to minimize the risk of the university taking the money and misusing it in a serious way. I mean, we had this problem also at Columbia, for example, where you probably heard about the Balagan a few years ago, where they had one department in particular that had several professors who became very well known for their anti-Israel activities both inside and outside the classroom. And the university decided that as a response they were going to create a chair in Israel Studies, and they got a group of the Jewish trustees who loved their university and were very disturbed by all of the negative attention that Columbia had gotten. So they gave something like $4 or $5 million to create this chair in Israel Studies. And then again, Columbia put Rashid Khalidi, you may know, who's been in the news lately as one of Obama's, not exactly an advisor, but someone who has informed him in the past, and another professor who had signed, for example, the petition to divest from Israel. Those were two of the people on the search committee, and so it wasn't surprising that the person that was chosen for the chair, again, was not the person I think most people in the Jewish philanthropic community would have liked to see in that position. So you have very costly chairs that need to be filled by very good people. And again, we have something like 3,000 universities in the United States, and you can't have 3,000 chairs of Israel Studies. In some ways, the situation has gotten a little bit out of hand, where philanthropists now have gotten so enthusiastic, they want to create chairs for their particular alma maters, and from a strategic point of view, which I'm interested in, it's not necessarily the best idea. For example, what I believe we need is to have chairs in Israel Studies and centers in the most influential campuses in the United States, where those people can have the biggest impact. But if a philanthropist went to a smaller university and that's the one they want to support, like we have a chair being created at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, Nebraska. It just so happens a lot of Jews made a fortune investing with this guy named Warren Buffett at the very beginning of Buffett's career. And they made a killing, and now they're investing in a chair in Israel Studies in Omaha, Nebraska. Well, it's not to say anything wrong with the University of Nebraska, but this is not the epicenter of academic life in America, or the place generating the future leaders for the most part. But people want to do it, so they'll be looking, and they are looking. I'm trying to do things with my organization, the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, in a slightly more strategic way. And we're trying to build the field of Israel Studies in a variety of different ways. We want this to be a legitimate academic field with a whole variety of aspects to it. So one thing that we're doing, in fact, the reason I'm here for the last couple of weeks, is we've created a program to bring visiting Israeli professors. As I say, since there are 3,000 schools, we don't want to endow professors everywhere. We can't do it. But what we can do is bring an Israeli for a year. And in just a year, an Israeli on a campus can make a tremendous difference. They can help transform a campus. They become magnets for students who, as I said earlier, for the most part have no other access to information about Israel other than what they see on CNN. So that a student who may not even be interested in their course can hear in another course, which very frequently happens, maybe they're taking a course in geography, and the geography or anthropology professor says Israel's an apartheid state. That student now can have an Israeli resource they can go to and say, you know, I heard this in my other class, is this really true? And it makes a tremendous difference. The students feel so much empowerment to know that there is a resource on their campus. And just to give you one simple example of how this can manifest itself on a campus, at the University of Arizona, right after the Second Lebanon War 2 years ago, the Middle East Studies Department organized a forum on the Lebanon War. So they had 4 Middle East Studies professors representing Hezbollah. Well, any other year, that would have been the end of the story. The students sitting in that lecture would have heard the Hezbollah point of view of the war. We had a visiting professor there, named, some of you may know, named Shlomo Aronson. Well, it was still 4-1, but Shlomo's a pretty effective person, and he was able to at least give another perspective. So that's the kind of situation that we find ourselves with. We started this program 4 years ago. We had very limited funds. We had 2 professors. The second year we had 8. This is our 4th year. We have 27. So far we have money for next year for 24, and I'm hoping we'll have a few more. But again, there's a limit to how big we can make this program. For one thing, we don't want to, drain the Israeli universities of all their best professors. And secondly, there are only so many places that you can do this and have a big impact. So we're trying again to be in the top 100 schools. We try to be at schools that have fairly large Jewish student populations, but occasionally we'll make an exception. For example, this year we have a professor at Notre Dame University. You may know it best for its football team, but it's one of America's best universities, has almost no Jews. It's essentially a Catholic university. But being there, I think, is very important. We have people at Harvard, we have people at Stanford, we have people at some of the best state universities like UCLA, UC Berkeley. So we've been able to get people into the major universities. And when I started, I didn't know if that would work. I thought, who's going to hire some Israeli professor? How am I going to convince universities to hire Israeli professors? Well, I discovered 2 things. One, the first thing I discovered was universities care mostly about money. And if you offer them money, they will do a lot of things, which is why the Arabs have been so successful. They offer a lot of money. The other thing I've learned is that you show universities the value of having an Israeli scholar, and they want more of them. And in fact, now universities come to me asking if I can help bring a scholar to their campus. So it's been very successful, and I think if you talk to professors who return from the United States, they will tell you how rewarding it is. We have a very onerous requirement that we place on them. Most professors, you may know, when they go on sabbaticals, they want to teach as little as possible because they usually are going to do their research, often to write a book. Our professors, we require to teach 4 courses, which is a fairly heavy load for a visitor. But it's because, as I noted, there are so few courses on Israel. And the fact that they're willing to do this, I think, has been rewarding to me because so many Israeli professors understand the problem we have in the United States and really want to make a contribution, and they come back and feel that they have. Another thing that we're trying to do is build up a future pool of scholars. As I said, even if we created 30 chairs of Israel studies, if philanthropists just were throwing money to universities, we couldn't fill those positions because we don't have any young scholars to fill them. So, and there's a good reason for that. Why would anyone go into the field of Israel studies, get a PhD, when they knew that no one would hire them? That all of the Middle East studies departments, which have become dominated by the anti-Israel, Edward Saadian view of the world, will never hire them. So if you can't get a job, you don't go into that field. So now that we're creating jobs, we're trying to, at the same time, give funds to graduate students to encourage them to get their PhDs. We're also trying to help people get postdoctoral fellows. As you probably know, the situation here in Israel is extremely bleak. So that if here you get a PhD, the problem isn't that no one's going to hire you because they're anti-Israel. Here the problem is no one will hire you because they have no money and they have no jobs. So we have a lot of outstanding young professors, young scholars getting their doctorates here. They can't get a job immediately, but if they come to the United States and spend a year doing some teaching, finishing their research, publishing their books, they can then come back to Israel with a much more marketable portfolio. We also are trying to fund conferences and publications, basically to do all we can to help people develop their Israel Studies programs. Now, we have a separate issue that is apart from the individuals. We have an institutional problem, that is, what is Israel Studies and where does it fit? And there is a lot of debate within the community of scholars of whether Israel Studies should be part of Jewish Studies. In some places, it is. And Jewish Studies people will make the case, well, how can you study Israel without studying Hebrew and Hebrew literature and Judaism and Jewish history? And that's certainly true. But then again, you study Israel, it's not just about Jews. There are minorities here. There is art and culture which is informed not just by Jewish history or by Hebrew, but by Arabic and by other cultures. So it's not just about Judaism. It's like if you were to study France, and it would be in Catholic studies because it's a Catholic country. You don't do it that way. But there is this debate going on, and so Israel Studies is falling into the field of Jewish studies in many places where really their focus tends to be more on pre-modern Israel, more on American Jewish identity, more on the Holocaust. And what's happened is we're seeing in some campuses turf wars, where you actually have the Jewish studies people sabotaging the Israel Studies department because they want to control the department, or they want to control the money. It's the sort of nasty academic and nasty Jewish politics to some extent, and it's having an impact on some campuses where, for example, at one campus, they were on the verge of getting a major in Israel Studies, and the Jewish Studies department killed it. Things like that happen. The other issue in many places in the debate is whether Israel should be part of Middle East studies. And logically, Israel is part of the Middle East. Why wouldn't you study Israel in the same context you study Jordan and Saudi Arabia, the rest of the Middle Eastern countries? And part of the argument is, why should you ghettoize Israel? That this actually hurts the study of Israel if you have this separate center or program in Israel Studies. It makes it look like this alien country that doesn't belong in the rest of the Middle East. The problem is, as I alluded to a second ago, is Middle East Studies has been completely taken over in the United States by the views of the followers of Edward Said, which was basically, to put it in a very compressed way, that the only way you can really understand the Arab world and other societies is if you're one of them. It's this very anti-academic approach in a way that you couldn't study Russian studies unless you were Russian. You can't really understand the Arab world unless you're an Arab or Muslim. And this has really taken over the field of Middle East studies, so that with very few exceptions, almost every Middle East studies department in the United States is rabidly anti-Israel. Won't have anything remotely positive to do with Israel, won't invite anybody who's remotely positive about Israel, won't hire anyone. So you have people like Martin Kramer, who wrote a very good book, if you want to learn more about how this came to be in the United States. Martin says, what we need is not Israel studies, we need better Middle East studies. Well, in theory, he's right, because again, Israel belongs in the Middle East, but practically it's ridiculous. It's just impossible, given that the Middle East Studies departments are so almost unanimously identified with Said and with this anti-Israel school, that you really can't penetrate them. You can't make Middle East studies better. You can only hope that eventually there will be some change, but we don't.